Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are going to be looking at what happened in the Philippines just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to everyone for being patient as I took a much-needed break over the holidays. I am so excited to get back into the swing of things and bring some new episodes to you guys. And that means starting with the promised next episode being about the attack on the Philippines at the beginning of World War II, even if it's coming out nearly a month after it was promised. Anyways, last time we were together, we discussed the attack on Pearl Harbor, looking at the attack itself and what led up to the attack. This week, we are going to look at how the attack on the Philippines differed from the more commonly recognized attack on Pearl Harbor. First, we must look at the history of the Philippine Islands themselves. This will be a brief timeline up until the time of World War II. Also, for reference, the islands that make up the Philippines take up about the same landmass as the state of Arizona, or the UK, or South Korea, just so we can sort of visualize the space. On maps such as the Mercator projection, the islands can look to be smaller than they actually are due to how close they are to the equator. Another thing to keep in mind is that when the Spanish colonized the Philippines, having been named for King Philip II at the time of colonization, one of the first things that they did was burn any and all records they could get their hands on. This is something that happened to many nations that had been colonized by Europeans as a way to erase any history prior to their arrival. So with that, we must keep in mind that the time prior to 1571, when the Spanish officially colonized the Philippines, the history that we know is based largely on archaeological research and any records from other countries that had had contact with the islands prior to Spanish arrival. From what we know from the pre-Spanish era, the islands of the Philippines followed a similar hierarchy scale to many of the other nations of the time, with a higher noble class, a middle class that was made up of warriors, and a lower class that was known as a dependent class that was made up primarily of serfs and slaves. As we moved into the 1300s, there was a more formalization of individual polities, similar to kingdoms that were popping up over the island. Groups were separated by these polities and also by ethnic group. The pre-colonial Philippines had previous contact with other surrounding nations, with the earliest contact from China being as early as the year 982. There would be further contact from Muslim traders in the early 1400s. Prior to the 1571 colonization, Portuguese explorers were making contact with the island in the early 1500s, the most notable being that of Ferdinand Magellan in 1521 in his conquest to circumnavigate the world. On Easter Sunday in 1521, Magellan planted a cross at the top of a hill that overlooked the sea, claiming the islands on behalf of the King of Spain. Ferdinand Magellan did not make it around the world as he was defeated in battle after underestimating the military capability of Lapu-Lapu, the chief of Macedon, less than a month after his claiming of the lands for Spain. The islands were under Spanish rule up until the end of the Spanish-American War, where the islands were ceded to the U.S. The peace treaty, which was only between Spain and the U.S., was negotiated in Paris, where Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Puerto Rico and Guam were also included in this deal and were given to the U.S. free of charge. Just before the transfer of power, Spain and its colonial power was quickly falling. The president of the U.S. at the time was William McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt, of Rough Rider fame, was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt was more aggressive in his views of war, where McKinley had been more reserved. It was Roosevelt's urging that Commander George Dewey was to head the Asiatic Squadron and head to the Philippines. After Dewey arrived in the Philippines, it was a scene of carnage. The Philippines had already been leading a revolution against Spain, which is what Dewey entered into. Revolution had broken out in the Philippines in 1896, and after years of fighting and an eventual stalemate, there was ceasefire agreements between Filipino and Spanish leaders. The ensuing battle, known as the Battle of Manila Bay, is described as 19th century civilization and 15th century medievalism lay confronting each other. In just 6 hours in 1898, Dewey and his men sank and conquered every Spanish ship. The captain of the Spanish flagship was killed, and the commander of Spain's shoreside batteries committed suicide. The only casualty on Dewey's team was from a heart attack. As I mentioned earlier, the colonial supremacy that Spain had had for hundreds of years was on a quick downturn. Add on the fact that Spain and the Philippines had been engaged in combat for multiple years, and the setup for the U.S. to supersede Spain was properly in place. In How to Build an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr, he writes that this war is usually called the Spanish-American War, but a more accurate name would have been the Spanish, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Philippine, American War. By the time the U.S. had joined the war, Spain's navy, which in any other circumstance would have been in better shape, had been in battle for multiple years across the globe. So with that in our heads, when the Americans landed on the shores and were able to rather easily overtake Spain, it wasn't due to the supremacy of the US Navy, but rather it was due to the years of work of all the other groups fighting Spain. In Cuba, for instance, the Cuban army, having enabled the US to land on Cuba's shores, were not acknowledged when discussing the takedown of Spain's military. In his notes, Teddy Roosevelt literally wrote, "We should have been better off if there had not been a single Cuban with the army. They accomplished literally nothing." Prior to Dewey's arrival, the revolution led by Aguinaldo had liberated many of the major cities and were actively in the act of laying siege to Manila. Aguinaldo had even already issued a declaration of independence, raised a flag, and played the Philippines' national anthem. Did Spain surrender to the Filipinos? No, they surrendered to the United States, who arrived at the very end of the battle. The Spanish governor explained his reasoning as he was willing to surrender to white people, but never to N-words. So now we know how the Philippines came to be under the US umbrella. Now what happened the day after Pearl Harbor? On December 8th, 1941, Japanese forces invaded the Philippines and they started a campaign that would last over 100 days and would result in the worst defeat in US history. In the aftermath of this campaign, 12,000 Americans and over 63,000 Filipino prisoners of war would endure the Bataan Death March, where it is estimated that 7,000 to 10,000 people would die as they were starved, shot, or bayoneted while they marched 65 miles to camps. Defending the Philippines had been a logistical nightmare for the mainland US. In the aftermath of the Japanese-Russo War, it was shown on the world stage just how powerful the Japanese forces actually were. The realization that Japan, just 1,500 miles away from the coast of the Philippines, were much closer than the US forces, with the closest base being in Hawaii over 5,000 miles away, and the nearest point on the west coast of the continental US was 7,000 miles away. There were talks of ways to defend the Philippines, plans referred to as War Plan Orange 3, and would fortify the Bataan Peninsula and hold on for as long as possible, which was realistically about 6 months. By the time World War II had come into reality, the US had already tired from having a territory so geographically far away and so susceptible to foreign armies. In fact, just 2 decades after the US had gained possession of the Philippines, they were ready to move on. In 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934 was signed, which would lead to full Philippines independence by 1946. Unfortunately, World War II happened right in the middle of that timeline. So what we have is a country that was on its way to independence, still under the military protection of the US, but in a limited capacity, with a foreign adversary less than a third of the distance away than it was from the US. FDR had assigned General Douglas MacArthur as the senior military advisor to the new president of the Philippines, President Manuel Quezon. MacArthur would command a combined American-Filipino force that was called the U.S. Army in the Far East, or the USAFFE. One of the biggest hurdles that MacArthur had was a severe lack of funding from the U.S. MacArthur would have to be granted funding from the freshly formed Philippine government, and as you can imagine, as a freshly minted independent country, there was not a lot of extra funding to be had. Trying to work with what he did have, MacArthur focused on rapidly building up the army and the air forces to protect the nation. MacArthur predicted that this kind of defense system would need funding of about $25 million annually. He was initially granted $8 million, but by 1941, that budget had withered down to $1 million. And instead of working with the British, who had their own holdings in Singapore, the US and the British instead spent the interwar years arguing about the size of a UK cruiser fleet. After the arguing over fleet size, the UK wanted to protect its own holdings rather than work with the US on coming together in the Pacific Theater as a united front. It wouldn't be until January 1941 that the US started earnestly working towards bringing reinforcements to the Philippines, but by then it was simply too late. They were sent new tanks, new B-17s, and 81 modern fighters. What they could not give MacArthur was more time to actually prepare his forces. In the time between July and Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had frozen over $100 million of Japanese illegally held US assets. In doing so, Roosevelt had put a full stop to Japan being able to purchase any assets like oil and other imported goods. Roosevelt had wrongfully assumed that this would not result in violence. When December 8th came around, the Philippines were also dealing with an ununified military force. We know about MacArthur as he headed the army, but there was a second man, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, who was in charge of the Navy, which had been organized as the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. These two men did not have any regard for the other, which resulted in a disjointed response to the initial attack. On the very first day of the attack, the entire Air Force fleet under MacArthur had been destroyed, and with the lack of air cover, the naval yard was easily destroyed by Japanese forces. With this near-complete destruction of both the Army and the Navy machinery, it was up to the ground forces alone to ward off the Japanese forces. Without any aerial reconnaissance, MacArthur was blind to any Japanese movements. With that, when the Japanese arrived on the shores of the Philippines, they arrived on the island of Luzon on the 22nd of December, with very little defensive military action towards them. MacArthur declared Manila an open city 2 days later, forcing the Asiatic fleet to either abandon or destroy critical supplies that had been stored in Manila. The USAFFE did put up an effort to keep the Japanese forces back, but just about 5 months later, on May 6, 1942, the USAFFE would surrender. What happened in the Philippines is not something that is widely known in the US zeitgeist, unlike its predecessor Pearl Harbor. When FDR wrote his infamy speech, the original version spoke to both Hawaii and the attacks on the Philippines. After some edits and revisions, the mention of the Philippines was taken out of its prominent spot and instead mentioned in the list of mixed US and British territories. In How to Hide an Empire, Daniel Immerwahr makes the argument that the Philippines were left out in this prominent way, as FDR wanted to convey in his speech that Japan had attacked the United States. At the time, the Philippines and Hawaii were both considered territories of the US. So yes, they were a part of the US. But where they differed was the Philippines were already on track for independence, and Hawaii, while not yet at the time on the way to statehood, would eventually become a state in the United States. Just before the attacks, polls had been taken among the continental American people, and there was very little support for military defense in remote territories. With that in mind, FDR made a choice. In his speech, FDR made sure to highlight what I will call the Americanness of Hawaii. FDR deliberately says that the American island of Oahu was bombed, instead of just calling it the island of Oahu. He also states that the American naval and military forces and many American lives had been lost. In doing this, he made what happened in the then territory of Hawaii something that had happened to Americans. He did not do the same when it came to the Philippines. And with that, that's where I'm going to end today's episode. I hope you can leave today's episode having learned something new about the Japanese attacks on the Philippines just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Sources for today's episode include an article from the UN titled The Philippines at a Glance, How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr, an article from the Naval Institute titled From Tragedy to Redemption, The Fall of the Philippines by James Frokovich, and an article from the American Historic Association titled When Did the Philippines History Begin? Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, please head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads. I'm pretty active on both. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one. Also, thank you again for being patient with me as I transition into a new schedule. It means a lot to continue to see support for the show even when I needed to take a break. New episodes will continue to come out, and I am looking forward to what this next year will bring.